Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome to, this is the first episode of the Examine Life with Phil since I finished my big series on the problem of divine foreknowledge. So, I'm going to take a minute here and tell you what I've got planned coming up. I had mentioned several times before that I'm planning on now doing a segment, another series on political philosophy, because I thought that would be pretty relevant since we're going into another presidential election cycle. And I am going to do that, but I'm actually going to delay that a little bit because I've got a chance to do a couple of episodes on another subject that I think is pretty important and should be hopefully pretty popular and interesting, which is creation, evolution, and the various issues involved with there. So I've already got a gentleman lined up to give a presentation on why he takes a theistic evolution approach and how he thinks that's compatible with Genesis, so hopefully that'll be up next week. And another coming week or two, Peter Razor, who I had on a while back to talk about Molinism, if you recall, well, he also is a co-author of a book called The Controversy of the Ages, which talks about the various positions Christians take on this, which is usually, roughly, young earth creationism, old earth creationism, and some type of theistic evolution. And so he's going to come on and talk about his book and the various positions Christians can take. And I'm trying to work out getting an intelligent design proponent and a young earth creationist proponent on here, because this is an important and interesting issue. I know I've thought about it quite a bit and wrote about it quite a bit, and everybody seems to have pretty set and often very passionate opinions about it, so I think it's worthwhile to explore. And then after I get done with doing that, I'll move on and go into political philosophy. This will also give me a little more time to study up on political philosophy a little bit more. And so, in the meantime, this week, I'm going to be making a claim that is very, very contentious and controversial on the internet, but not so much everywhere else, which is that a conspiracy theory is almost never the best explanation of any event. This seems relevant to me in light of the conspiracy theories that are circulating with that guy Jeffrey Epstein who died in prison supposedly due to suicide. Well, I say supposedly, almost certainly due to suicide. But maybe I'm jumping a little ahead of myself here. I haven't really proven or established that yet. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this week. But in the meantime, before I do that, I want to give out another facepalm and sigh award of the week. Because I didn't do any of those for the last couple of weeks after I did that whole big one for the Democratic debates, because maybe I got, facepalm and sigh award out because there was just so many of them to do there. So I guess I'm a little behind the curve on this one because this is based on a tweet that actually came out 2 weeks ago. But as everyone who listens to this podcast knows, I'm not on Twitter for philosophical reasons. I think Twitter is a horrible platform. It's incredibly stupid to try to take the very complex, difficult problems and ideas that our society is grappling with and break them down into tweets. Twitter is a terrible platform, it's a terrible idea, and we'd all be a lot better off without it, and so I'm not on it. Nonetheless, I do pick up bits and pieces of what other people are saying about it, and so 2 weeks ago, the presidential candidate Kamala Harris put up on her Twitter account, she said, quote, "As president, I will take executive action to revoke the licenses of gun manufacturers and dealers that break the law, require anyone who sells more than 5 guns a year to run background check on all gun sales, ban the importation of AR-15 style assault weapons." Now, despite what my English professors from college would want me to do, I'm not giving her a facepalm and sigh award for the bad grammar of her tweet. I just hate saying the word tweet. It's kind of revulsive to me, but I guess I have to here. So anyhow, it's not for the bad grammar. Rather, I'm giving her the facepalm and sigh award here because she said some things that aren't true. And it's not really just that she said some things that aren't true, because that can happen to anybody. It's that she said some things that aren't true, which demonstrates that she's horrifically ignorant of something that she should know about, of which it's easy to find information about, on an issue which she claims to be passionate about, on an issue which she's running on for president, and yet she's just flat dead wrong on it, even though there's all those things involved. So I'll explain a little bit more here. it's not really considered a logical fallacy if you just say something that's wrong in one of your arguments. For example, a Muslim might want to claim that God revealed the Quran to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel, therefore the Quran is God's word. Now, I think he's wrong when he said, a Muslim who said that, I think he's wrong when he says God revealed the Quran to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. But the logic that the Muslim is using in that argument there's nothing wrong with the logic. I just think he's wrong in one of the premises, so the argument doesn't work. But the logic is fine. It's in every reasonable sense a perfectly valid argument. But suppose instead you have a different type of argument going on, where somebody who is, well, they claim to be a history expert, and they're applying for a job to be like a professor or a chair of a history department, let's say like a prestigious university, and they claim to have studied history quite extensively. And this person is making the claim that when Columbus came to America in about 1492, that was the first time any person set foot on the North American continent. Now, you should immediately think, hang on, there's something wrong here, because it's pretty easy to verifiably demonstrate and learn that Columbus was not the first man to set foot on America. There's widespread archaeological and historical evidence that the Vikings were here long before he was, and those were only the Europeans. Obviously, there were Native Americans living in North, Central, and South America hundreds and thousands of years before Columbus ever got here. So to say that Columbus was the first person to set foot in any part of the North American continent is absolutely ridiculous, absurd, and it's very, very easy for somebody to find out otherwise. And somebody who claims to be an expert in history and is trying to get a job as the chair of a history department at a prestigious university not only should know better and be in a position to know better, but it'd be positively shocking for them not to know better. And that's more analogous to what's going on with Kamala Harris here. And so here's the problem. She claims she's going to ban the importation of AR-15s. AR-15s are not made outside the U.S. with the possible exception of one minor variation. Phoenix Ammunition, which is a ammunition manufacturing company based in Detroit, Michigan, they replied to her tweet saying, quote, "With the exception of FN, literally every AR-15 manufacturing company is based in the United States. Imagine knowing literally nothing about an industry that you plan to regulate with an iron fist." And so here you have the problem. Kamala Harris is running for president. Gun control is an important issue. She should be able to know some basic things about the industry that you can learn with a simple web search, like almost all AR-15s are manufactured in the United States. Well, virtually all of them are. So banning the importation of AR-15s is quite literally one of the most worthless and stupid measures anybody could take in relation to gun control, because it will quite literally do nothing whatsoever. So that's why this is more comparable to the history example than it was the example I gave of the Muslim, where she should be in a position to know what the facts of this are. The job she's had as a Democratic senator should demand that she know what the facts of this are, because it's an issue she claims that she's passionate about. And the job she's, in a sense, applying for should demand that she knows what the facts of this issue are, and yet she's horrifically ignorant about it. Now, the fallacy of argument from ignorance is actually not this. It's something completely different. It's where you might say something like, well, we don't know for certain that there aren't aliens in the universe. We don't know for certain that there isn't extraterrestrial life out there. Therefore, there is. Or the famous atheistic biologist Richard Dawkins gave a similarly bad argument in one of his books where he said something along the lines of, we know of no reason why evolutionary processes couldn't have produced creatures like us with the appearance of design, therefore it did. Which is, those are arguments from ignorance. So what Kamala Harris is doing here is not argument from ignorance. In fact, technically, as I said, this isn't even a logical fallacy, but it's a case where reasonable people could look at this and say, there's something very, very wrong here. When you're in a position where you should know this, you're applying to go to a higher position where you should know it even more, and you claim that this is an issue that's important to you and you're passionate about, and yet you're ignorant of the basic details. It's very much like the example of the supposed history professor I was citing before, claiming, hey, Columbus was the first person here. Well, anybody who knows anything about history definitely knows that's not true. Anybody who can even type a search function into the internet should know that isn't true. In a certain sense, the only way to really explain the supposed history professor example I came up with is this person is willfully ignorant or dishonest. And likewise with importing AR-15s. Anybody who knows anything about firearms knows that's going to do nothing. Anybody who can type a basic search function into the internet should be able to immediately learn with 10 or 15 minutes of research that isn't going to do anything. So, what explanation is there? Why didn't Kamala Harris or somebody on her staff do a basic web search? And I'm hesitant to call people dishonest if I can avoid it, because that violates the principle of charity I try to operate under, which I think is a good principle and I recommend we all do it. But there is something that's pretty much approaching willful ignorance when a Democratic senator who claims that she wants to be president and is running for president and claims to be passionate about gun control does not even know that AR-15s are manufactured in the United States. And this is actually a common problem I've observed with a lot of people who are gun control advocates, is many of them are very, very passionate about the issue, and at least some of them rightly so, because, hey, they see people dying due to gun violence and they want to do something about it, and that's very commendable. But they never stop to take the time to actually educate themselves on the issue at all, and so they wind up saying things that are flat out wrong and stupid, like what Kamala Harris just did. This is also comparable to how you might meet some Christians who are very, very, very passionate about their faith in Christ, which is a good thing, but never bother to stop and learn any of the theological nuances and importance of the faith, and things like why Christians believe in a Trinity, what it means to say that Christ is the Son of God, what the theories of atonement are, and various other theological issues like that are very, very important. So many of these Christians who are very, very passionate, and rightly so, Christ is a great thing to be passionate about, but they'll wind up saying very stupid and ignorant things because they've never bothered to stop and take the time to educate themselves on what it actually means to be a Christian and follow Christ. They're just pursuing it with their whole heart and none of their mind. And it seems to me that what Kamala Harris and many gun control advocates are doing is very, very similar, where they're running off with their passion and their emotions, and they're not stopping to take the time to actually educate themselves on what's going on. And so, as I said, this isn't a fallacy of argument from ignorance in the formal sense, but I would say this is kind of something like a fallacy of willful ignorance, or maybe we could call it argument from passion, because maybe it's the people involved are so passionate that they don't think they need to stop and educate themselves on what's going on because the passion is overriding their intellect. I'm not really sure what we could call this error, but it's definitely an error, obviously, because it's just bizarre and wrong that somebody in her position does not know this when you can learn it with a 5, 10, maybe 15-minute web search. And she puts it out in an official capacity for her national campaign. It's not like a slip of the tongue. It's not like she said something off the cuff and realized it was wrong. I'm very sure that tweet was vetted and edited and looked over by herself and other people in her campaign, because that's how these things are done, which then raises a further problem of, well, does that mean the people who edited it and looked at it and things, they're also ignorant and they really have no idea what's going on as well? So this is a problem, and it's definitely worthy of a facepalm and sigh award, because Kamala Harris is running to be the President of the United States, and she's a top-tier candidate. There's a reasonable chance she might turn out to be the President of the United States. And we should demand better than this of the people who are going to be our leaders. You know, some people might come back, hear this and say, whoa, she's just pandering to her base. Donald Trump did the same thing back when he was running. And yeah, Donald Trump did. And it was stupid and wrong when he did it, and it's stupid and wrong when she does it. And we need to demand better of our political leaders than this. So, for displaying horrific ignorance of a topic which she should know about in her capacity as a senator, she needs to know about in her capacity as a potential future president, and which she claims to be passionate about, which it's very easy for her and everybody else to find out the information, I'm giving Kamala Harris the facepalm and Sigh, award of the week. Okay, so now we get on to the contentious claim for this podcast. Well, what I just said might be contentious to some people, but it really shouldn't. So the contentious claim here is that a conspiracy theory is almost never going to be the best explanation for any event. And really what I mean by that is a combination of events. In popular speak, people often refer to things like 9/11, the JFK assassination, the moon landing, various other things that there are conspiracy theories about, including Jeffrey Epstein's death and or suicide. We refer to them as a single event in popular speak, but they're really a combination of events. There's all kinds of details that went on, all kinds of people who were involved, and what you want to do is find some type of theory that best explains all those various events, all the various evidence, all the various pieces, and put it together. So what's a theory that takes all those pieces and fits them together tightly and neatly so we can make sense of it? And what I'm going to claim here is a conspiracy theory is almost never going to be the thing that actually makes all the pieces fit together. Now, I'm going to be working here quite a bit off of inference to the best explanation. I did a podcast that talked a lot about inference to the best explanation, so if you want to get some more details on that, go back and listen to episode 24, which was how inference to the best explanation demonstrates that Christ rose from the dead. About the first half of that, I just went through and explained what inference to the best explanation is, how we can use it, the philosophical details on that, and my primary source that I used was a guy named Bruce Russell from Wayne State University, who was actually an atheist philosopher. And so about the first half of that really shouldn't be contentious to anybody who studies anything relating to epistemology and inference to the best explanation, at least I hope not. Well, I'm not going to go through that all in detail again now, because it would just be a rehash. So if you want more details, I'll refer you back to that. I'm just going to give the broad outline so I can get going through this. So inference to the best explanation is the type of reasoning we would want to use in cases like how we explain historical events in the past, how we explain what things happened. And it's very easy to understand at just an intuitive level, because it's one of the most common types of reasoning we all use in our day-to-day life. So you wake up, you look outside, and it's overcast and the ground's wet. What's the best explanation? Well, it rained during the night and the storm clouds haven't completely passed yet. Now, it could well be that it just so happens to be overcast. Those aren't storm clouds, they're just clouds. And for whatever reason, one of your neighbors decided to hook up a hose and spray the lawn and sidewalk and everything around your house to make it look like it rained last night. Nothing incoherent about that, no reason that couldn't have happened. But is that a very good explanation of what happened? Well, no, probably not, because pretty much all the time that it's been the case that you look outside and it's overcast and the ground's wet, it's because it rained. And furthermore, it seems unlikely you'd have a neighbor who would want to do that. And furthermore, if you did have a neighbor who would want to do that, you'd probably be aware of it, or at least have some cause to think why they would want to do that. If you've got a crazy neighbor who does some crazy things, you're eventually going to become aware of that, and so then you naturally begin to suspect them, and so on and so forth. So the point being, you would want to think, yeah, it's probably because it rained, even though you're not absolutely sure about it. It's not deductive reasoning. And you'd want to discount the possibility that your neighbor just soaked your lawn for no reason, because it's pretty unlikely. That's not what neighbors tend to do. And if your neighbor was the type of person who was going to do that, you'd probably have some evidence or indication that was the case. So, the theory that says the neighbor soaked the lawn, well, that leaves you wanting some more evidence, wanting some more explanations. It doesn't really fit very well with what you know about the world, so it's not a very good explanation. Conversely, the theory that says, hey, it just rained in the night, that's a pretty good explanation. It fits tightly, it makes sense of everything, doesn't leave you demanding or wanting more data, more evidence, more information. Not really anything about it that makes you go, something seems weird here. And so that's a pretty good explanation. And that's very loosely speaking what it is. But I'll go through here and give you some more firm criteria on what inference to the best explanation is. I won't go through the acronym Bruce Russell used. Go back to the other podcast to listen to that if you want more detail. I'm just going to do it relatively loosely here for the sake of time. So what we're looking for when we do inference to the best explanation is what theory or possibly combination of theories best explains all the facts involved. That is, what theory or theories has the best explanatory power and the best explanatory scope. And what I mean by that is it'll fit with all the available evidence and it doesn't leave any evidence out. And you can see that in the brain neighbor example. Well, in that case, both theories fit all the available evidence and there's no evidence that they don't explain. But the neighbor one doesn't fit the next criteria, which is it doesn't leave us expecting more evidence or facts than there are. Well, the neighbor one does leave you expecting some more evidence and facts than what they are. Neighbors don't tend to act that way, and why would your neighbor do that? That's kind of weird. We also want to avoid theories that are ad hoc. Now, ad hoc is a Latin term that means for this. It's when somebody makes it up. It's a just so story. My brothers and I would do this all the time when we were playing as kids, because that's one of the things kids do. So we'd be playing outside. My brother would have the toy gun. He'd say, "I shot you. You need to be dead now." And I'd say, "No, I'm not dead. You did shoot me, but I'm wearing the bulletproof vest, which I just so happen to think of now and didn't tell you about until now." That is, my bulletproof vest example was a ad hoc, just so story. And so a pretty extreme ad hoc example that you might want to appeal to, well, you shouldn't want to appeal to, but maybe you would, with the lawn being wet example, is you might want to say, "Oh, my lawn just gets wet. There doesn't need any explanation. I don't need to explain it by my neighbor soaking the lawn. I don't need to explain it by rain, nothing else. My lawn just gets wet." That is, you're appealing to just that event for just that reason, for just that explanation. It's not a good explanation because it doesn't go beyond the scope of just that event. You're not appealing to things that could happen in other circumstances, like the rain or your neighbor. And that's why both the rain and the neighbor are a better explanation than just saying, my lawn just gets wet. Now, you also want the theory, if it's a good explanation, to be simple. That is, it's not needlessly complicated. This is somewhat in line with Occam's razor. You don't want to multiply causation beyond necessity. People often say that Occam's razor means whatever explanation is the simplest is true. No, that's not what it says. It actually says don't multiply causation beyond necessity. So, go back to your lawn in the area outside your house being wet. What's a better explanation? Your neighbor sprayed the lawn down, or two of your neighbors sprayed the lawn down? Well, obviously it seems simpler that one of your neighbors would do that than two. So you don't need to appeal to two because one explains it fine. Therefore, probably more likely and a better explanation that one did it. Or conversely, what's a simpler, better explanation? That your neighbor sprayed your lawn down and it rained. Or that it just happened to rain. Well, obviously, the fact that it just happened to rain would explain that just fine, so you then don't need to turn around and appeal to the neighbor spraying your lawn as well, in addition to. And it would work vice versa as well. And so that's what it means to not multiply causation beyond necessity. If you've got one or very few items that explain things, just look to that instead of trying to say, oh, well, this had to come in, this had to come in, this had to come in, and bring in all these other factors. If you don't need to do that, don't do that. And the last criteria I'll get into here is you want your explanation to be plausible. That is, it's not incoherent in the sense of being contradictory, and it doesn't deviate very grossly and widely from well-established and potential possibilities. Now, the term contradictions gets thrown around far, far too loosely in common everyday speak. Very often things are labeled contradictions which actually are not. I discussed that in a little bit more detail back in episode 16 when I started talking about the problem of divine foreknowledge. And if you want to, again, get more technical, go back and listen to that. But anyhow, if there is a contradiction in the theory, then the theory absolutely has to be false. No question about that. Now, in the case of your lawn being wet, if, say, someone were to come up while you're trying to figure this out and say something to you like, well, my theory is that your lawn is both wet and not wet at the same time. Well, that's a ridiculous theory. That's a contradiction. That theory absolutely cannot work. And generally speaking, most theories that have contradictions in them, they aren't quite that explicit because everyone would recognize what a stupid theory that is, because we all kind of intuitively recognize, no, contradictions do not exist. Usually, contradictions are more buried in the theories and they're a little bit harder to flesh out. But anyhow, if the theory has a contradiction, it isn't true. It can't be true. Now, the other criteria there was plausibility, and plausibility is a bit more of a subjective thing, but what that loosely speaking means is that it just fits with the norms of what you already see in the world. So in thinking about your lawn being wet, one of the reasons why I think you would want to reject the idea that your neighbor sprayed your lawn to make it appear that it rained, and reject that in favor of the theory that it actually rained during the night, is because that just doesn't seem very plausible. That's not in keeping with what neighbors typically do. That's not a normal thing. That's not an everyday common experience. Now, if you live by a neighbor who was crazy and prone to do something like that, then that would be your common, normal, everyday experience, and that theory would suddenly become more plausible. And so plausibility is a little bit context-dependent, and there's some person-dependentness on it as well, because what's going to seem plausible to one person sometimes will seem implausible to another person. But there's certain ranges in which we can say, yeah, that's plausible and that's not, and every reasonable person should agree. Since we're talking about conspiracy theories here, I would say, for example, every sane and reasonable person should agree it's implausible to the point of being ridiculous to claim something like the X-Men caused 9/11. Since the X-Men are fictional characters, they're not going to be able to cause an actual event. Okay, so with that criteria somewhat loosely established, now I just need to look at what the facts are that need to be explained. And in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, he was the multi-million-dollar financier and convicted sex offender who was found dead in his cell back on Saturday, August the 10th. And it almost certainly was a suicide. He was awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges, and his death came less than a day after a trove of disturbing court documents were made public offering details about his alleged abuse, as well as possibly implicating a bunch of other rich and very powerful people, because he'd ran in circles like that. The guy had hung out with Bill Clinton, he'd hung out with Donald Trump, and of course both of them have then distanced and said, oh, we barely knew him, which, okay, whatever. Probably not true, but that's not the point here. The point is, the guy died in a jail cell, supposedly by suicide, right as a bunch of documents and details were coming to light that probably would have cast aspersions on a lot of very wealthy and powerful people. So there were people with wealth and power who had motive to silence him, and that's where the conspiracy theories start coming in. Now, where these theories get more interesting is that 3 weeks before his death, on July 23rd, Epstein had been found semi-conscious in his cell with marks on his neck, though it's not clear if he'd tried to hurt himself or if he'd been attacked. Officials investigated the injury as a possible suicide attempt and then put him on suicide watch, which would entail placing him in a special cell where he could be constantly monitored by prison personnel, and that would prevent him from having any means of taking his life. But Epstein was taken off suicide watch on July 29th, and returned to the special housing unit after a psychiatric evaluation determined he was no longer a risk to himself. He was placed in a cell with another inmate at first, but that inmate was later transferred to a different unit, leaving Epstein alone in his cell, which reportedly had a metal door and a small glass window. It's not clear why he wasn't immediately assigned another roommate. Further, the guards at the prison failed to follow the proper procedures, despite the fact that they had apparently assured the Justice Department personnel that they would do so. These guards are supposed to check on inmates in the special housing unit where Epstein was about every 30 minutes, but failed to do so on the night in which he died. In fact, it seems like 2 of the guards who were supposed to be checking on him had fallen asleep and failed to check in on him for 3 hours, and then in an apparent attempt at a cover-up, they falsified their records to hide the mistake. So there definitely is a cover-up here. Now, whether it's just guards falsifying data about whether or not they were sleeping or something more, that's another question. But confirmed, there's a cover-up here. Now, a further important detail is that guards at this prison had been working massive amounts of overtime. Apparently, they're very short-staffed there, and many of them are working 60, 70-hour work weeks, thanks to them having less than 70% of the guards they need to have. Now, there is no video footage of what actually happened in the cell, because apparently, while there are video cameras in that section of the prison, there are none that target the inside or the outside of the cells there, which maybe that's standard procedure, but again, that's something that, might seem odd. It's been reported that those 2 guards and possibly other guards there who were involved in stuff in the prison are not cooperating with the Department of Defense's investigation into these details. And while the medical examiner did, in fact, rule that Epstein's death was by suicide, there were some bones broken in his neck which are more likely to be broken if somebody's strangled than if they commit death by suicide. However, I think the percentage that was thrown around was something like 6% chance that you get those bones broken if you hang yourself. However, it is more likely to happen if you're an old person, and Epstein was an old guy. I think he was 66, if I'm remembering correctly. Now, there are more details being reported online, but as is always the case with these things, we're probably going to find out in another couple months or a year that some of these details are false, other ones are true. But the ones I've listed here, these ones seem to be pretty much as indisputable as some facts can be in this a case like this, so I think they're the ones that need to be explained. And you can just obviously see how there seems to be motive involved here, and the timing of Epstein's death seems to be quite coincidental and suspicious like that. So I would say from the get-go, it's reasonable that people are going to look at this and go, hey, wait a minute, there might be something going on here. But there's a big difference between a standard that says, hey, I have some questions, there's something here that seems a little off, I've got some questions that need to be answered, and the standard whereby you can say, powerful people had him killed, the Clintons had him killed, as I've been reading online. There was a day, I think that was the day after he died, there was like a trending hashtag called Clinton body count or something like that, where people were clearly trying to say, oh, the Clintons had this guy offed because he was going to say things they didn't want to get out there, or something along those lines. And there's a much, much higher standard, obviously, or at least it should be obvious, that needs to be established before you can go around reasonably pointing fingers at other people and saying, yeah, they did it, than there is to say, hey, something's a little off here, we need some answers. So it quite clearly meets the criteria where you can say, I need some more information, I'd like to have some answers here, something seems off. Now, to help us keep this in perspective, let me go through some details on some other conspiracy theories, most of which are false, but at least one of which it turns out was true. One of the more popular conspiracy theories that goes around online is in relation to 9/11. There was the whole truther movement that came out after that, where people were claiming the government was involved, that President Bush was somehow responsible, and they would point to things like one of the hijackers' passports was found at the site, not really burned, but they couldn't find the hijackers' bodies or the black boxes of the planes. One of the prominent conspiracy theorists in regard to that, a 9/11 truther, claimed that computer graphics will explain how you saw video of the planes hitting the World Trade Center. And there's other things like that where Senator Bob Graham, who was one of the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, did say that the intelligence agencies were actively resisting giving him and the 9/11 Commission information. So there's obviously a whole lot more details that we can go into about this, but just loosely speaking, I think it is another case where could a reasonable person look at all the events that happened in 9/11 and say, hey, we have questions that didn't get adequately answered, we think maybe the government's holding some information back? Well, absolutely. But does it follow from that the government orchestrated 9/11 against its own citizens? No, it absolutely does not. In fact, just to start with, Popular Mechanics debunked nearly all of the claims of 9/11 truthers that are featured in those conspiracy documentaries like Loose Change. The vast majority of them have just been completely debunked. There's no evidence or reasons to think that, at least no good evidence or reasons to think that, say, the Pentagon was hit by a missile, or the buildings at the World Trade Center were destroyed in controlled demolitions or something along those lines. It's just not plausible or true, and there's no good evidence for that. Now, but take a different question, which is maybe the government holding some information about what happened on 9/11 and the related events back from the public. Well, I think that's almost certainly the case, and I think probably anybody who's sensible about it would agree with that. The government classifies material all the time. And often what you find in conspiracy theories is people kind of will conflate things. They'll conflate the government's holding some information back with, therefore there's a conspiracy. And if you had all worked in the government, or have been involved in it, that's not true. The mere fact that somebody doesn't want to tell you something doesn't mean they have a conspiracy out to get you. The mere fact that it's highly likely there's still classified information about what happened at 9/11 and in the relation to all those events that hasn't been shared with the public, it doesn't follow from that the government orchestrated 9/11. So take I'd say a much more mild conspiracy. Did government agencies fail to protect us on 9/11 and then attempt to hide the fact that they failed? Essentially, did they attempt to hide their own screw-ups? Well, this seems likely and somewhat reasonable. I mean, Senator Graham was saying that the intelligence agencies were resisting giving him and the rest of the commission information, and it's pretty well known and been widely reported that there was a lot of interagency hostility between the CIA and the FBI and other intelligence agencies and services prior to 9/11. And I think, if I remember correctly, that was one of the things the 9/11 Commission blamed the whole thing on. So you'll often hear claims like the U.S. government covered up involvement in and support for the 9/11 terrorists by elements within the government of Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is a good ally. Well, Saudi Arabia is considered a good ally of the United States, even though they're in many senses not a good country that doesn't treat their citizens very well. And they decided it was better to preserve that relationship than actually hold elements of the Saudi Arabian government to account for what they did. Now, on the face of it, this seems much more likely. You've got some motive, you've got some opportunity, you've got some not really strong evidence, but at least a few iffy things kind of pointing there, like when Senator Graham said these agencies aren't giving us the information we need and they're actively resisting it. But on the other hand, the problem comes in when you have a conspiracy of any kind that involves more than 2, 3, maybe 4 people. It then becomes extremely, extremely hard to keep it quiet. So if there was a lot of evidence that elements within the Saudi Arabian government knew what was going on or supported the 9/11 terrorists, then inevitably people in the FBI, the CIA, and other intelligence agencies who were researching this and investigating it would have found that evidence. And it wouldn't have been just like 3 or 4 guys. It wouldn't have been a small team. A lot of people would have found that evidence, and they'd have started passing it up the chain, and it eventually would have gone up to the president, the CIA director, the NSA, the director of the FBI, and so on. Those people would have known about it. And so you inevitably then have quite a few people who know about it and have to keep quiet. And it's not that you can't keep something like that quiet for a little while, but our government leaks like a sieve. Anytime you've got 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, maybe 80 or 100 people involved in a conspiracy, it's just not going to stay quiet. Somebody's inevitably going to talk. And General Michael Hayden, who was the NSA director at the time this was going on, he's said to people who interviewed him, asked him about it, that any conspiracy to hide involvement by the Saudi Arabian government would have had to be directed and issued from the highest levels of government, like the president or somebody next to him. And he was about at that high. The NSA director works for the president. He's in the cabinet. And he says, there was nothing like that I ever saw or that was on my radar. So you have to claim that he was lying, as many of these people do. But not that just that he was lying, but that somehow he managed to get the investigators in the FBI who found this, the investigators in the CIA who found all this, and all their superiors, and all the former directors, etc., etc., etc. He had to get all of them to lie, and still keep lying now, about almost 18 years later. And that's pretty implausible, as I hope you can see. A common thing you actually see in most conspiracy theories is what I'm going to call the myth of the hyper-competent government. That is, people look at the government and think it functions like it does in shows like 24 or other action movies and spy thrillers like that. The government always knows what's going on, it's always ready, it's always capable, it's never caught flat-footed. But the reality is pretty much quite the opposite. The government is a slow, lumbering behemoth of a force that often is very far behind the times and usually has no idea what's going on. Our government tends to be far more incompetent than it tends to be competent. And the fact that something like 9/11 actually happened is pretty good evidence of that. The various agencies were all competing against each other, they weren't sharing information, and so people slipped through, and 9/11 happened because our government was incompetent for various reasons. So a conspiracy that argues that, say, the U.S. government somehow staged 9/11 and like the Pentagon was hit by a missile is... I talked to somebody on Facebook a few years ago who tried to argue that, and that's just absolutely ridiculous because there isn't really any evidence left over for that, but not even more importantly, if you drive by where the Pentagon is, there's a giant freeway right nearby. All kinds of people were driving by and saw the plane come out of the sky and hit the Pentagon. There were hundreds of witnesses to this. Furthermore, it's not like all of these witnesses were military people at the Pentagon or something like that who the conspiracy theorists can claim were bought off or had to lie or something. They were random people who just happened to be going by on the interstate that day. So the government somehow managed to ensure that everybody who just happened to be going by on the interstate that day at that particular moment were all their stooges. Come on, it just doesn't work that way. And likewise with the guy who said that, the planes didn't really hit the World Trade Center, that was computer graphics. No, there were witnesses in New York who saw that happen. So you're going to have to claim that the government got to all of them, and in the last 18 years, none of them have lied or recanted. It just doesn't work that way. And that's the main problem I keep coming back to with most conspiracy theories, is they inevitably involve dozens, hundreds, and in some of these cases even thousands of people, and none of them talked and none of them leaked. People just don't work like that. They always talk, they always leak, it always gets out. You have a conspiracy of 2 or 3 people, you might be able to keep that quiet. That could conceivably work. Expanded into the tens or the dozens, something's going to get out and somebody's going to come poking around. It just works that way. And the reason why conspiracy theorists, I think, tend to think the government could do this is because they have that idea of the myth of the highly competent government, the government that can always make things work, when it can't. Our government is, I think it's now almost $25 trillion in debt. Congress can't even pass a budget, for goodness sakes. So, no, the government is not that competent. It's actually very, very incompetent, which is a whole nother problem that maybe we should talk about when I get into political philosophy. We'll see. Now, for a counterexample, let's look at a conspiracy that actually did happen. The CIA actually used LSD and other drugs to try to experiment with mind control on people with mind control I think it's about 50 years ago now in the MK program. It really happened. You can look it up. It's true. So there have been secret government and military conspiracies in the sense that was a secret operation when the CIA was doing it. But the reason why we know about them is some evidence was left behind about MK There were people who testified, this is what's happened to me. There were people who came forward. There were leaks. There were documents left over. Congress held hearings about it. Now, a lot of the documents were destroyed because the CIA tried to cover up what they were doing, but there's enough evidence left that we can say, yeah, the CIA really did do this. It was pretty deplorable. Now, conversely, with something like 9/11, there are no smoking gun documents that point to the government where you can say, aha, they did this. There has been no military person who came forward and said, yeah, I shot the missile that took this down, or something along those lines. It just isn't there, and there isn't evidence left. And so, getting back to inference to the best explanation, conspiracy theories in regards to 9/11 leave us expecting more evidence than we do see. That is, every time there's been a conspiracy of any kind that we're aware of, it's always left some evidence. Somebody's leaked something, somebody's always testified, somebody's come forward. It just always happens, especially in the U.S. government, which can't keep secrets worth anything. Therefore, the reason why those conspiracies, among other things, are a bad explanation here is They leave you wanting more evidence than there actually is. They leave you saying, no, if that was true, we'd expect to see this. We don't see this. Therefore, that's not true. And I think in a loose way, that's kind of what people mean when they would say something like, there's no evidence for that. But you should spell it out a little clearer, because usually there's no evidence for that just becomes a mantra that it's kind of meaningless. So getting back to Epstein's suicide, I've heard a guy on YouTube who's a lawyer who talks about legal cases talking about this, and he made the comment that if you're going to think it's just bad timing and coincidences, it's such a case of a combination of bad timing and coincidences that it's extremely improbable, and if it was in a movie, we wouldn't believe it. We'd claim it's too improbable. And, he might be right about that in a movie, where if it was written in a movie, we would say that's bad writing, we don't enjoy that story. But that's actually not the way real life works. Improbable and stupid events happen all the time. Go read a couple of history books. Dumb things happen sequentially all the time that lead to catastrophe. 9/11 again. Apparently, the CIA knew who a couple of the hijackers were, and these hijackers were renting a house from an FBI informant, but the CIA decided not to inform the FBI what was going on. Now, that's a stupid and really bizarre coincidence, but it actually happened. If it was in a movie or TV show, would I believe it? I'd think, that is contrived writing. But it really happened. And so, my main point here is that the evidence does fit very well with the idea that this guy killed himself in the cell. That's perfectly plausible that could happen. People have done that in prisons before. This guy clearly had the idea of trying to do it. Well, not clearly, but very likely had the idea of doing it before because he'd been on suicide watch. He had cause to kill himself because he was probably going to go away to jail for the rest of his life at this point. And the medical examiner says, yeah, that's what caused it. So it's reasonable to conclude that's what he did. Now, if you want to take another theory and say, well, no, somebody offed him, somebody arranged for him to kill himself or something like that, well, that's going to leave you demanding more evidence. For example, well, those two guards who were sleeping, were they in on it? If they weren't in on it, how is it that the people who did somehow conceivably break into the prison and either kill him themselves or arrange it so he could commit suicide himself, how did they know that the prison guards would happen to be sleeping that particular night and that particular time? How did these guys avoid all the cameras and things involved? Or assume the prison guards were in on it? Well, did they get paid? Where's the money? Where's the evidence they got paid? They're probably going to lose their jobs over the fact that they were sleeping, so maybe if in 5 or 10 years we learn they've all bought mansions in the Bahamas, then you're going to learn, then maybe there's something to that. But the point is, if there is some conspiracy where somebody murdered Jeffrey Epstein or somehow arranged it so that he could commit suicide, there should be some evidence left of that, and it's pretty conceivable we could count on somebody somewhere in the chain of events to talk. Somebody moved the money around, somebody had to do it, somebody had to tell those guards to go sleep, etc., 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 and there's just going to be some evidence left somewhere, which, at least at the moment, we don't see. Now, maybe sometime in the future, new evidence comes to light and we can change our opinion and reevaluate. That's normal. That's fine. That's good. But if that's your best claim is, I'm going to wait on more evidence to vindicate my theory, well, that is an argument from ignorance. That is a fallacy. That is a fallacy in logic. Now, that same YouTube lawyer I was talking about did say something along the lines of, well, what you can agree is that this shows that the prison system is not functioning the way it should if this guy was able to commit suicide in his cell. And that is something worth looking into. Why is it that so many of the prison guards there were working so much overtime? Why were they so horrifically understaffed? What, if anything, can be done about that? That's a very good issue to bring up. But just because things aren't functioning the way they should doesn't mean there's a conspiracy. It's much more likely that the prison guards were simply overworked, tired, and violated regulations because they're working 60, 70 hours a week and don't even care anymore. That's a much better explanation than somebody paid them off to look the other way and fall asleep when somebody walked into Epstein's cell to strangle him, and somehow there's no evidence left of this, and the guards who were sleeping on duty somehow managed to hide the evidence that they got paid off or something like that. So that's my chief point here. A conspiracy theory is almost never going to be the best explanation of any type of event or sequence of events, especially when you start talking about things like 9/11, the moon landing, JFK's assassination, and yes, Jeffrey Epstein's suicide. It's almost certainly the case that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. It's almost, well, not stronger than almost certainly the case that the U.S. government was not directly involved in 9/11 in any way, and so on and so forth. And people who claim otherwise, well, they're going to do that, but they're just not using good reasoning. And that's why we need to look to things like inference to the best explanation to help us reason, because it shows us why all these things are wrong. It gives us a framework for understanding why all these things are wrong. Okay, so wrapping up here, what'd you think of this episode? I really had a combination of different topics here and just kind of mashed them together. Next week I should be on track doing the creation evolution stuff, but I just wanted to do something about conspiracy theories and why they're almost certainly wrong almost all the time this week, because it seems relevant and it's fun to talk about these things. So, is there a conspiracy theory that you're partial to yourself, where you think, there's really something there that you want to tell me about? Write in and tell me about it. Do you think I'm wrong in my assessment that conspiracy theories are almost never true? Write in and tell me about it. You can always reach me for comment of any kind at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and I've started a Facebook group for the podcast as well. Just type in The Examined Life with Phil and it'll take you right there. And if you enjoy the podcast, please, share it on social media, give it a like or review or whatever is appropriate on the podcast app or program you use to listen to it. Give us a rating on iTunes. All these things help get the podcast out to more people. And, if you don't like the podcast and don't want it to get out to more people, write in and tell me why, because if you got some good criticisms, I'll be happy to hear them. So that's it for now, and next week I'll be back with what should be the first part of a series on creation and evolution. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.